Welcome to the Friends with Money podcast, brought to you by Money Magazine, creating financial freedom for Australians since 1999.
Today we're talking to Serina Bird, author of the Joyful Frugalista and host of the Joyful Frugalista podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, Serina.
Thank you so much for the honour of being part of this podcast.
We're going back to school soon, and it's a really expensive time for parents. I think, but there was issues last year when kids went back to school and they no longer fitted into their school uniforms because they'd been working from home for so long. But now we've really got to get organised. So let's look at how can we reduce back to school expenses? When and how do you start the preparation?
Thank you. A good question. I think the back to school often catches families unaware, mine included. I think often we budget sometimes for Christmas, maybe for holidays, but we don't generally budget for going back to school. In my case, all of our bills, or at least a vast majority, fall within December, January. Quite coincidentally, we have a lot of our insurances and car rego and other things that fall within that time. So end of January is always a very tight time, even though it's budgeted for and we know that it's coming. So I think, the first thing is just to know that this is going to happen every year. How much preparation you should do? Well, it really depends on your children and what age they're at and so forth. But usually things like school stationery packs can often start the year before, because that's often when the schools will send out the notices, say November, December the year before. So I think it is good to sort of start thinking about back to school as the kids are leaving the school year. That is obviously harder when kids haven't been in school before. But if you usually, it's coming, right? So it's the same thing every year.
And are there times of year where, the school stationery packs are on sale, or, it might be a good time to put something away for the next year?
Yeah, well, thank you. The whole school stationery packs is a really interesting one, because what I've been noticing, especially, with my own kids' school, and I think this is across the board now, is that usually they are provided by an external provider where you're given a code to go online and purchase them. And so they are set packs. So that the cost of that, the price of that doesn't change throughout the year. It is the same thing. The question then is whether you just buy the online version, because it's pretty easy. It's just a couple of clicks. It might take 5 minutes, it might take 10 minutes, whether or not you kind of get frustrated with the system and your system crashes or you have problems with the cart. Usually it's, 5-minute exercise, or whether you do it yourself to save money. Now, in the past, I have done it myself 1 year, but usually I just go with the easy version, mainly because of the time, because, you've got 5 minutes versus several hours, several days, going to different shops, shopping around. It's quite, in terms of the return on time, doing it online is the best version. But one of my frustrations with that is that often there's no option to click to delete from the cart the things that you don't need. So then you've got, like, every year you're buying things like rulers, erasers, exercise books when they might have some left over from the year before, pencils when they might have half a pack of pencils. So from a sustainability and also a savings point of view, there are some problems with that model. The alternate is doing it yourself. The best time of year to buy is the year before. 1 year it happened that we got, I think 50% off some really good stationery packs that we saw at Big W, and we thought, great, we'll do our own the year after. So that's really the best time to buy, when you see all the discounted items at the end of back to school. Or alternatively, getting in early, because I noticed this year that pretty much from the 1st of January, there were a lot of sales on back to school items. And I guess it's a bit like Christmas, where stores want you to be able to purchase as early as possible because it helps with their supplies. So, for instance, Big W, again, they had a sale of items that were between 25 and 33% off if you purchased them early, which was a real incentive to get in early and do your own. In terms of the savings for the book packs, to me, it wasn't worth it. I think maybe from memory, I saved about $20 off per child, which wasn't a huge amount when I considered the amount of running around I had to do. But if you have a really large family or things are really tight, that can be a huge saving. And of course, then there are the sustainability benefits as well.
Serena, the other thing, of course, is the uniforms and getting your kids ready for, going the first day, whether it's sports kits or bags or whatever you need to get. When do you sort that out? And do you feel that when you're going shopping for the year, your things are going to last you the year, or are you buying mid-year as well?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, the supply chain issues are a real issue with this one as well, particularly for those who have children in public schools and you need things like shorts and pants and skirts that you get through the major retailers. We had several months, a couple of year before last. It's difficult now. We're a new year. You forget which year you were in. But first COVID round, my kids pretty much ran out of black tracksuit bottoms, and we couldn't get any for ages. So, supply chain issues are a real issue there. But it's also worth considering second-hand options and sustainable options. I'm always amazed. I think I've tried to give away second-hand items through my school community before, and despite a lot of people being really committed to sustainability, they won't accept second-hand things. It's just quite amazing.
So what do you do with those items? Can you sell them in other ways? Do you maybe put them on Facebook Marketplace or something like that?
Well, a lot of those items, depending on what school you're at, are often fairly low cost. Like if you're at a private school and you're talking about blazers or expensive items, well, it's a different cost structure. But a lot of these items, one of my frustrations too is there aren't many ethical ways to buy some of these school uniform supplies. My children's school actually has a fair trade option for buying their shirts. All of their shirts now are made through fair trade. But in terms of the bottom half, which are usually bought through bulk department stores, usually they're made offshore in places like Bangladesh where the labour standards are really not that fantastic. And the cost of them is also not very high as a result. So like if you've bought anywhere, paid anywhere between $6 and $12 for an item, it's pretty hard to get much of a return to sell them on Marketplace. And you can donate them to op shops as well. But once again, there's not much in there for op shops in terms of their margin for resale. So unfortunately, it is very difficult to resell some of these items. If I really can't, find somewhere for them, I will usually cut them up and use them as rags because some of them are quite good quality, and that's what I do. In our case, the school accepts donations and it sells items for $2 to parents. And that's something to consider because a lot of schools now will have options for secondhand, usually as a fundraiser for the school. If they don't, consider starting one. Or alternatively, a lot of schools now will have Facebook groups for parents to communicate with each other. So that's a great way to put those things out too, to say, I've got a bulk lot, say, of items that might fit a certain year. You could sell them or, just give them away in terms of a pay it forward for another family that might really need that.
Serena, what's your advice on things like shoes? Should you buy, really expensive shoes that are maybe going to last the kids, or do you think it's easier to just buy something a little bit cheaper and, buy multiple pairs throughout the year?
I think it really depends on the child. In my case, I have one child who needs to wear an ankle foot orthotic because of a disability, and we need really good quality shoes to last with those because he walks in a funny way, he can't really lift his foot very much, so he scuffs it a lot. So we have learnt from experience that if we buy cheaper shoes for him, he just runs out of them in a week or two. If you have a child who's doing a lot of sport, you're going to need a better quality shoe because they're just going to, it's just going to run through them really quickly. So I think it does depend a lot on the child. Now, you would think that, they grow out of them really quickly, and so, a cheaper shoe would be better. But, often they are really, really active. They're running around doing sports. So it really does depend on your child. But our experience has been that a slightly better quality shoe will last a lot longer for them.
Aside from the supply chain issues, are there any other things that make this year different for you as a parent sending kids to school?
It's just a very uncertain outcome, a very uncertain environment. Everyone's just really concerned about the impact of COVID. My eldest has been double vaxxed. My youngest is getting his first shot this Sunday. And I think a lot of parents like myself are feeling this sense of unease about not knowing what's going to happen. We've been living in this COVID environment for some time now, But I think we've had this sort of sense that our children have been safer up until now, but I think that has sort of stopped. So I guess it is a bit of an unsettling time for kids. And my eldest is starting high school this year. Normally that's a time of, great celebration and change of life, but there's still this real sense of unease and a bit of fear, I think.
Yeah, it's very different. Would you say that there's any ages that are easier for parents to, get their children off to school, in terms of cost?
I think it's easier when you've got an older sibling that can pass things down to. Of course, then it does make it more expensive if you do have one child, more than one child. But if you do have another sibling, and if you do have that culture in your house where everyone's okay with wearing secondhand, which they are, in my household, that certainly does make it a little bit easier. So I think that's the main thing. I think in general, the younger children tends to be a little bit cheaper because their textbook and stationery demands are a little bit lower. But, once again, having siblings really, really helps.
Aside from uniforms, when you're sending kids to private schools, there's a lot of other expenses that come up that you may not have thought of. What sort of things would you budget for, excursions? Who knows if they're going to happen this year, but generally, what other things would you need to budget for?
Look, all of the above. My children go to public schools. I went to a private school when I was growing up, and certainly there are a lot of additional expenses that are there. There are also less school holidays. So for young children, you've also got to budget for, more time for school holidays and care there. Uniforms are usually a big one. There's often more expensive uniforms with things like blazers and hats. There could even be other uniforms for, say, church uniforms, or maybe even gloves. I think we had to have those from memory, different sports uniforms. So there are a lot more to consider. Once again, there are usually second-hand options that are available, or even ask someone who's had children who've gone to the same school to see if they've got second-hand clothing. But I guess I would recommend, if you are sending your children to a school where some of the costs might be fairly expensive, is to find someone who's gone to that school and actually have an honest chat with them about how did you find it, what were the costs, how did you reduce those costs, because that might help as well.
And would you say, in your own experience, you budget for the school expenses way ahead of this time of year, or do you just pay things as they come?
I do an overall forecasting budget, so I have an overall idea of things, and I always know that this time of year is expensive for us. Mid-year, about July, I'm usually going, wow, we're so ahead with things. This is awesome. This time of year, it's not. This time of year, I'm like, we just need to be a little bit more careful, notwithstanding that we've got holidays and other things. So I have a general awareness of this. And I think sometimes with our finances, it's a bit like being at the beach and watching the waves. There are, there's high tides, there's low tides, there's things coming in, there's things going out. We tend to think of things as being very linear, but in terms of our, there's cycles within the year. I mean, there's cycles within a week, but there's cycles within a year. And this is just a more expensive cycle with that. But if you know it's coming, when things are at lower tide, you can be a bit more prepared, put a bit more away so that when you are at this high tide phase, you know that you can weather it. And I guess that's my overall sort of approach. I'm a little bit more generalist with it. But when I do my forecast budget, I know that this is coming, so I don't freak out. And I go, look, I know this is forecast, so it's fine. It'll be okay. But some people may need something more structured. I'm privileged to be in a good financial situation. We're really pretty much middle class. Not everyone is. And if people are really, really struggling, you might have to be having that money put away in a more formal sort of a method. Maybe you might need a different account set up, for instance, to put money in so it's prepared for back to school.
And Serina, just one last question. If you are struggling and you need to save a bit, what are the areas of the going back to school expenses can you maybe minimise, like, get a cheaper lunchbox or a bag? Like, what are the things that you think that are going to be the easiest to cut costs on?
Reuse from the year before, wherever possible. I mean, do you need a new school bag every year? I mean, if the school bag from the previous year is working fine, like, why do you need a new one? If the lunchbox from the year before is working fine as well, why do you need a new one as well? And I think younger people increasingly are understanding the need for sustainability. So when you explain it to them in terms of we're reducing plastic by not buying a new one, they understand that much more than if you said, we are poor, we can't afford it. It's a very different kind of vocabulary. So starting with those things that you have already is really important. On the stationery, it's really tempting sometimes to go for a much more generic version. Like if the school says we want this particular type of notepad, you go, oh, here's a cheaper version. But just keep in mind for your children that they don't want to look like they're the odd one out, like the poor kid in the class who can only afford a poorer version of that notebook, especially like if they're all going to be handed out in a class. So I tend to not skimp on those. I want to make sure they all do sort of look the same so that the kids do fit in. But I understand, once again, not everyone does have that option. But definitely reuse wherever you can.
It's funny that you say you don't want the kids to stand out. You know, when I look at old school photos of my own, I see that my mum didn't put me in a uniform until I was in about 4th class. And not because we couldn't afford it, but she just kind of liked me wearing different clothes. And I guess at the time I didn't realise what a big deal it was. But looking back, I think, wow, I must have really stood out in an awkward way for all those years. Maybe that's why I've turned out like I have.
Unique and individual. I mean, some kids are fine with that, but some kids really, they just want to really belong. So just being conscious of those things.
Absolutely.
But secondhand clothes is not the big problem that you might think it is, because children, they want to feel that they can run around and make mess and be dirty. And I have boys, so they're not very fashion conscious anyway. If I had girls, it might be different. And so actually having second-hand clothes is a bit like, you know, The Sound of Music, where Maria made all the Von Trapp children clothes out of curtains so they'd have play clothes. You know, it feels liberating for them because they can make a mess in them and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, you know, I'm an only child, but there was always hand-me-downs, whether it was from cousins and they'd come to me and then my clothes would go to someone else. You know, you'd always see someone in the family wearing someone else's, you know, second-hand clothes. There was no stigma to it at all. And, you know, I love the idea now.
So do I.
Anyway, thank you very much for your time on this today, Serina. It's been fascinating, and it's a really important topic for parents who are, you know, struggling with the going back to school on all sorts of levels this year.
Yeah, it's a very difficult year for many people, but wishing everyone resilience and strength and hoping it's a stellar 2022.
Thanks for listening to the Friends with Money podcast. For credible, independent and easy to understand financial commentary, visit moneymag.com.au. Please remember that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are general in nature, and further independent advice and research based on your personal circumstances should be sought before making an investment decision.